Rest in peace, noble ship of the sea. You lie dormant at the bottom of the ocean. It's been 100 years since that iceberg tore into the Titanic and all those people died. Some of them were rich, some of them were poor, and some of them didn't know what they were in for. But there was a ship called Titanic, and all those people did die. But what's the real story behind it? Let's explore the history of Titanic. The time is 2:19, and at this moment, 100 years ago, the Titanic was descending into the ocean. What do you suppose was going through their minds at this critical moment? I imagine most people were panicking and going, totally freaking out. But I suppose the mothers were like, what's going to happen to my children? Are they going to live? Are they going to die? And most people were probably assuming that they were going to die. So the boat goes down, and at 2:20 it sinks. And they go under the water, and they're all sort of twirling around like some ginormous whirlpool. And, and then they come up, and they have to, find something to grab onto. A piece of wood or anything. And there's all these screamings, these loud noises everywhere, because there's thousands and thousands of people panicking all over the place. So in the ocean, there are mothers, fathers, husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, everyone, all freezing in this ocean, because it was an extremely cold night, and the water was freezing. So they started beginning to get very cold. And so they had to cling on to something. And they were clinging really onto life. That's what they were clinging onto. They needed to survive. And so the boats were called back. And perhaps one or two people were lifted onto the boat because they were alive. But I imagine a vast quantity of them were dead by the time the boats came back. And so the people who did survive, who got into the lifeboats, they all travelled over to a boat called Carpathia, which may not actually be pronounced correctly. And they got onto this boat, but of course they were in the lifeboats, and the Carpathia was very high. So basically the children were put into little sacks and lifted onto the boat by pulley systems. So that's how they got onto the boat. Which I think, is quite an extreme measure, in an extreme situation. But of course the Carpathia wasn't on Titanic's doorstep, so they had a long journey to get there. And I suppose, what do you think were going through their heads while they're in the boats? They were probably thinking, will I ever see my husband again? Will I ever see my wife again? Will I ever see my children again? That's all the things that be floating around in their head, because they were all separated, of course, because women and children were put in the boat first, and they had to be of high class to go in the boat first, so they all split up. And so they were probably thinking, will I ever see my husband again? Possibly not. So that was all going through their heads. But I mean, going back to, the actual sinking part, the Titanic hit the iceberg around about 11:40, I think it was. And a lot of these people, they thought, well, sorry, but I don't see any evidence of anything, so I'm going to go back into that room over there and have my brandy. So they weren't really, the high-class people, I suppose, weren't really bothered by this when it actually started. Which was rather foolish of them, really. But then when everyone started to panic, yes, of course, battle stations. And they all started running off to these lifeboats. And I think the interesting thing is, Titanic's story, there weren't enough lifeboats. But then, after that, there was a new law enforced which said that there had to be a suitable amount of lifeboats on board to accommodate all people. Now, in my opinion, the Titanic was so big that they could have had a room that was just for lifeboats. That makes a sensible idea. Have a whole room for lifeboats, and then that solves your problem quite quickly, isn't it, really? But what really sends a chill down my spine is the live accounts that people have given. For example, they sent another boat an SOS, but they ignored it. Now that is terrifying, in my opinion, because they could have helped. but they just ignored it. So that, I think, is quite frightening. And I think the whole idea of SOS is frightening. You know, this signal for help. And I think that is terrifying. This whole idea of calling for help, and you're stuck in the ocean and there's no one to help you and you're terrified. You don't know what's going to happen. It's terrifying. And I suppose that was going through the people who were on the SOS machines, you know, thinking, someone answer, please. We're stranded here. We've got a situation. They need help. And I think that's quite terrifying. I mean, I'm a big fan of the Titanic story. I mean, I think it's so interesting. I really do. That whole, it's a fascinating part of history. Fascinating. Because of the accounts that people give. The water was intensely cold. It felt like 1,000 knives driven into my body. One's natural instinct was to try and get out of it. I was swimming out to the head of the ship. Of course, I soon realised this was rather foolish, so I turned back to swim across clear of the ship for starboard. For a moment, all was silent, and then across the waste of the water wafted a sound that will ever ring in my ears. The cries of those perishing in the icy waters. They did not drown, for they could not withstand the cold water, and died one by one. Captain Smith of the Titanic shot himself on the bridge. The engineer also committed suicide. 3 Italians were shot dead in the struggle to the lifeboats. All around me, everyone was screaming. I heard one person scream out, "Save one life!" I'll never forget that. A man in front of me jumped off the boat, and without even thinking, I jumped off too. The Titanic was big, but I didn't like the smell of the paint. It's 3:26, a whole hour I've been filming this video, stopping on little bits and filming bits and taking bits out. So I think it's safe to say it's well past my bedtime and I should really be going to bed, otherwise I'll be going to bed about 4 o'clock and I've got to be up about 8:30 tomorrow. So I'm going to edit this video and shrink it ginormously and pick out the best bits, like acrylatane. And so I'd just like to say, I'd like to sing a verse of "For Those in Peril on the Sea," if I can remember it. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arms hath bound the restless waves, who bids the mighty ocean's deep its own appointed limits keep. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee, for those in peril on the sea.